Welcome to Chatter. I'm David Priess. This week, Professor Catherine Steele on how the norm against political violence eroded in the Roman Republic.
You could say that the Roman Republic is unlucky in facing three distinct challenges, against none of which it turns out to have adequate internal mechanisms.
Professor Catherine Steele, welcome to Chatter.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Of course. Thank you for joining us from Glasgow, yes?
It is Glasgow, yes. I'm gazing out and I can even see some sunshine.
Amazing. That's a wonderful day then, right?
Yes, quite.
Tell us a bit about your background, especially what drew you to Republican Roman history and Cicero in the first place.
It's been a slightly circuitous route. I went to the kind of school in the UK where you could do Latin and Greek, and I did. I confess I did Greek in part not having expected to do it at the first moment of choosing exams, because the head of classics sidled up to me and said, "Catherine, have you thought about doing Greek? I do think you might enjoy reading classics at Oxford." And as an impressionable 13-year-old, I was so kind of flattered that obviously I changed my plans and did Greek. I suspect I would have still ended up as a historian, but probably a modern historian. Anyway, so I did in fact get into Oxford and I read classics there, and with a startling lack of imagination stayed on to do a doctorate. And it was a doctorate on Cicero, and I'd hated Cicero at school. He's such a tedious author to read if you're reading him in Latin and your Latin isn't very good. But prose composition, so translation into Latin, was part of the curriculum. And the person who was taking me for prose comp, the great scholar of Greek literature and its more intriguing corners, Ewan Bowie, he took Latin prose comp and he said, well, the way to do Latin prose comp is really to read some Latin for an hour or so before you try writing any. And really it's got to be Cicero. All the other great prose authors in Latin are just too difficult to imitate. So, okay, got to read some Cicero. So I did, and by that point my Latin was just about getting good enough that I could read him quickly. And as soon as you start reading Cicero quickly, it is just intoxicating. He is so clever and so inventive, and his approach to problems, I was just astonished, and I wanted to work more with this. So I did my doctorate on Cicero, and once I'd done my doctorate, my first job, which is still the job basically I've got now, was as a lecturer in classics at the University of Glasgow. And they were looking for somebody who could teach Latin prose literature, but what they really wanted was a Roman historian, because that was the gap they were filling. So I found myself in a position where most, though not all, of my teaching is Roman history, a lot of it done in translation, of course. And as the years passed, I turned my thesis into a book, and my first publications after that were on Cicero. But I gradually got more and more interested in the wider political context. I'm a political historian of the Republic. And I did the volume on the late Republic for the multi-volume Edinburgh History of the Ancient Rome, which I think was really the point at which I thought, hang on, I'm going to get particularly... There are lots of questions here I want to answer. And then I had a grant on fragmentary oratory of the Republican period, which again forced me to think about politics because of public speech is a political phenomenon at Rome. And so one thing has led to another, but it's been a slow journey, and it's been one in which I've often not really been sure of the questions I'm actually trying to answer until some way into a research project.
It's really interesting to hear you say that for multiple reasons. One that strikes me is you don't come at Roman history with a bias because you're coming at it as a political scientist or as a historian who you already have a chip on your shoulder about something. You're coming from the source material first and foremost, which actually shines through in your writings, that you bring the story from the sources. But that raises the second point, which is Cicero. And given that how dominant Cicero is in so many ways of people looking at this period as a source, of course, he was not just writing to inform, he was writing to influence. And he had a stake in the even the history he was writing about was to make a point or on someone's behalf. So, yes, there were others. There was Livy and Appian and others you can pull from. But Cicero being such a dominant and, as you say, magnetic, attractive source, that's dangerous for someone doing history of the period too, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And a lot of ancient history of this period is, I think, undermined by insufficiently critical readings. Mm-hmm. Having said that, I mean, I think the real challenge is not that we can't unpack what Cicero is trying to do. Mm-hmm. I think the real challenge is that Roman historians, and I am one of them, tend not to be sufficiently self-critical about their elite focus, right? So it is very easy to be a political historian of Rome and enjoy yourself in the sources and not step back and ask the bigger questions that we should be asking. And so one of the most interesting things that's going on, I think, in Roman history at the moment is a willingness to reflect on the limitations of being interested in elite men only. 2-3 decades, there's been a huge amount of really good work on gender, and increasingly we are putting front and centre something which, of course, Cicero himself never does, which is this is a society that's based on the labour of enslaved people. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So those, I think, are actually kind of, if we take the field as a whole, bigger problems. Mm-hmm. I think if you're prepared to say, look, I'm interested in political history, then there is enough diversity in the source material we have, not least because we do have a fair amount of official documentation, albeit preserved epigraphically and in Greek translation, that, you know, with sufficient caution and self-awareness and a willingness to say, okay, we have a problem here that's probably insoluble, you can do quite a lot with what we've got, even though so much of it is Cicero. And I mean, let's face it, if you've got to be stuck with one dominant source, there are worse sources to have.
Yes, there are many places around the world of ancient history that historians would be foaming at the mouth with glee to have a source so rich and deep. And yet you find yourself writing about anything, even in the modern period, writing about anything from a single source, especially a source with his own or her own point of view. And a lot of writings have to be caveated with probably, or this suggests this, or this along with other fragmentary records indicate this. And yet that doesn't make for compelling reading. When you're trying to read a popular history of ancient times, you don't want every single sentence to be caveated in multiple ways based on the uncertainty of the sources. And I think that does lend more casual readers, like I have been, to read this and have a sense of certainty that, oh yes, you know, in the year 212 BCE, this definitely happened, when it was one line in one remaining source. And I think that has an effect on the public of feeling like we know ancient history in some ways better than we actually do based on the credibility of just a few sources.
Yeah, but again, one needs to be. I mean, it's not an on-off switch. I mean, it's not that a source is credible or not credible. Yeah. One needs to be willing to think about what kinds of information are reliable and what kinds aren't. I mean, one of the things that I think is fairly consistently true, if we go back to Cicero's speeches, they can be incredibly misleading in how they present information. But it's actually quite hard to catch him out in an outright false statement. Okay, so the misleading approach is through selection and omission, and the way that information that doesn't really have anything to do with each other is placed next to information that, you know, placed next to things. So, you know, even in Priscilla, right? One of the hardest cases I suspect Cicero took on, and one of the ones in which he has to go through some of the most extreme contortions in order to try and get this individual acquitted, which he manages to do. It's very difficult actually to say this is a full statement at any point in the thing. And similarly, you know, some of the, I mean, there is a big divide in Roman history around about the Second War against Carthage. it seems to me. Before that, huge areas of uncertainty about basic facts, let alone interpretation. Once you get after the war with Carthage, yes, lots and lots to discuss and debate, but it becomes more familiar issues about what you choose to emphasise, rather than the need to express radical uncertainty about the course of events. As a sketch of what is going on, what does the Roman political system look like, say, on the eve of the war against Hannibal? So you have what later Greek theorists would call a mixed constitution. That is, it isn't a form of political organisation that you can say straightforwardly is democratic or oligarchic, or aristocratic rather than oligarchic, or monarchical, right? So the location of power to observers is divided among different groups within the Roman state. And there is a balance or a tension, there are different ways of looking at it, between those different elements. So sovereignty sits with the Roman people, and that is a kind of fundamental shibboleth that everybody involved in Roman politics at least pays lip service to. That's adult male citizens only, probably from the age of maybe 15 or 16. Mm-hmm. And you're quite right to talk about elections, because the mechanism by which citizens exert their power is through voting. And there are two sets of decisions where citizen voters make the decision. One is around policy, expressed through legislation, right? So all legislation can only come into effect if it's been passed by an assembly of the people. The other arena is the choice of governors, magistrates, executive officers. And one of the striking things about the Roman Republic is that those elections are for individuals. There aren't any political parties, and they are for annually held offices in most cases. Mm-hmm. So you have a change of government effectively every year. And as a citizen, you're exercising your vote very frequently. Once a year in elections in 220 there are probably slightly under 20 mm-hmm. significant magistrates. The number goes up over the course of the Republic. And then as many occasions of legislative voting as may be required. And of course, one of the really interesting things about the Roman Republic, in terms of what we think about participation, because the picture I've just sketched to you sounds like really pretty intense citizen participation, right? Is that votes can only be cast in the city of Rome. Mm-hmm. Or even by 220, lots of Roman citizens don't live in Rome. Rome's conquest of the Italian peninsula has been accompanied both by the enfranchisement of certain communities within Italy and by the settling of colonies. So one of the big questions about Roman politics is the degree of participation by citizens who don't live in Rome. Been some interesting work on this recently, piece by Bob Molstein-Marx on extra-urban voters recently. I think a reasonable hypothesis would be that elections for magistrates are probably quite well attended by the extra-urban population because it's an annual event. Legislation perhaps less so, but it is probably also the case that legislation tends to cluster early in the year, partly because of when tribunes, who are another kind of elected officer, when they're elected, they take office in December, and they seem to start their year by introducing whatever legislation they're interested in. Mm-hmm. Which doesn't confirm it, and there are various moments over the course of the Republic where more rigour is imposed in terms of the legislative timetable, with a view, it seems, to making it more predictable when the vote would be, and therefore more people could participate. Okay, so that's the democratic element, and that sounds pretty impressive, right? So why don't we think of the Roman Republic as a democracy? Well, partly because elected magistrates have huge powers, coercive and executive, which means that they look like the people in charge. And also because alongside magistrates and people, we have an aristocratic body, or at least a body that gives a role in the government to a small elite, and that's the Senate. And the Senate really is quite a peculiar bit of the Roman constitution in a way, because you don't actually need a Senate, in the sense that there's very little that it does that something else couldn't do. But it seems to be there. It's a fundamental aspect of the Roman state. The historians who tried to make sense of Rome in the regal period, before the Republic was established, were quite clear that there was some sort of advisory body even when Rome was governed by kings. And it's an advisory body. That seems to be how people conceptualize it. But it's an advisory body that makes a lot of decisions. And increasingly those decisions lead to action, right? So that it's not that the only way to get something done in Rome is to pass a law, or in fact be a magistrate and do it. The Senate seems to have and develop powers to authorize action. And for a Greek historian such as Polybius, who spent a lot of time in Rome, but when he looked at it, he was quite clear that his Greek-speaking fellows tended to be very impressed by the Senate, because one of the things that the Senate did was it heard embassies and it made decisions about foreign policy. So to external foreign powers, the Senate looks like a hugely powerful organ of government, because that's what they are dealing with, as well as Roman magistrates in actually on the ground, wherever they might be campaigning ahead of an army. And so that's one of the factors that I think makes it particularly difficult to really get a grasp on the different kinds of power in the Republic and how they were perceived by the people who held them, as well as how they actually functioned within the state as a whole. And of course, one of the big debates within Republican historians is precisely, is the democratic side of the Roman constitution at all meaningful? And I mean, as you know, for much of the 20th century, the story about Roman politics was that it's not a democracy in any way. An oligarchy controls events, and they manage to manipulate the people's votes so that they effectively are passing offices between themselves, with only a kind of sham election taking place. Fergus Miller challenged that in the mid-80s with a couple of kind of hugely important articles about democracy, and the debate continues to rumble on.
Yeah. Well, I want to dig down on the implications of a lot of what you mentioned there, but just a little more scene setting first. You dropped in there these annually elected tribunes, and because we'll be talking about some of the tribunes in the major events that follow in our discussion, I want you to mention those briefly. The role of the tribunes, and if my limited understanding is correct, the tribunes had sanctity of their person. I'm not even going to try the Latin, but they were sacrosanct.
Yeah.
How and why did that norm develop, and how did it enable the tribunes to do what they did in the system?
Great questions. I mean, the tribunate is bizarre. Let's face it. That it's very difficult to come up with any exact parallel for what it does. Partly because it seems to be in many ways such a negative office. Okay, so a bit of history, kind of plunging if I'm assuming things are not being clear. So the tribunate of the plebs, and okay, let's start with the word plebs. Plebs is not the same as populace, right? So populace is all citizens, and women can be citizens. They're not voting citizens, but they can be citizens. So the populace is the entire Roman community, free Roman adults. The plebs are a very large subset of this, because early Rome, there is a distinction between patricians and plebeians, and this is a distinction of birth. You're born a patrician, or you're not. And the patricians at the start of the Republican period had a monopoly on political power, and the tribunes of the plebs emerge out of what is called the struggle of the orders, the two orders being, in this context, patrician and plebeian. And it's a struggle for political equality. And the tribunes of the plebs emerge out of that as defenders of plebeian rights against the patricians. Okay. And the sacrosanctity that you mention has, at least kind of in our historiographical tradition, its origins in an oath that the plebeians take, that they will protect their their representatives. And I think that's quite important when we come back to 133.
Yes.
Because I think that's quite significant in one of the kind of key dramatic moments of 133. But anyway, so the idea is if you lay hands on a tribune, right, if you breach his sacrosanctity, the plebeians will kill you. Right.
Which makes it interesting that it's not something that is driven, by the table. The law does not dictate this. It is a social norm.
It's self-help.
Yeah. And of course, social norms need to be upheld. If not, they either erode over time, if you think of it, teleologically, that things change and you're looking at an end point, or they evolve over time.
Exactly.
But
and
this is important.
Tribunation and sacrosanctity, although we're going to talk about a moment in 133 at which it seems to wobble, it continues down to the end of the Republic and beyond, right? Because there's a beautiful little story, I think it's in the 60s BC, where the tribunes have fallen out with the consuls and they imprison the consuls, and they do so by the simple expedient of putting them in a room and sitting on a bench in front of the door. Right?
Wow. Yeah, that's a powerful visual representation of the norm that had been around for centuries at that point.
Yeah, and it continues to be really important because think of once we get into the imperial system, emperors hold tribunician power. And one of the reasons that is important and significant is it grants them sacrosanctity. And it, as it were, forces the Roman populace, or the Roman plebeian populace, into collaboration with emperors, right? But what we need to... So what can tribunes do? Well, it's an emerging story. So when I said that they were often obstructive, their origin seemed to be in protecting the people against patrician mistreatment. Hence the importance, actually, of their physical sacrosanctity, because a lot of what a tribune can do is actually getting in between, right? Stopping coercion. And they acquire other really important capacities, the most important of which is they can put forward measures which bind the plebeians. Okay, plebiscita. They can articulate the plebeian will. Right. There are also 10 of them every year, which becomes an issue because at the point at which they are established and thereafter nobody really thinks through what happens if tribunes disagree with one another. Okay, they're a powerful collective symbol, but there aren't kind of mechanisms for dealing with them. And they're supposed to be available. So they're supposed to be in Rome during their year, and they're supposed to be, you're supposed to know where a tribune is, because you might at 3 o'clock in the morning need to race down and find a tribune because some bastard patrician is there and he wants to rape your daughter. Okay, so that's where it all starts. But two broad lines of development, I would say, we need to kind of understand the tribunate in the period from the war against Carthage onwards, which is looking slightly different. One of them is that the plebeians win the struggle of the orders, so that they have political equality. They can hold the consulship. They can become members of the Senate. And a plebeian aristocracy develops. We have an elite that is, composed of patrician and plebeian families. And so the precise point of the tribunate seems rather to erode. But it still persists. And for quite a long time, the tribunate, or tribunes, seem to be able to, most of them, happy to work in harmony with the Senate. And some of this is just convenience. It's much easier to get an assembly of the people together in its tribal organisation and vote on a measure than it is to get the 193 centuries of the Centuriate Assembly together to vote on legislation. So in practical terms, tribunes are quite useful. They can put forward legislation, etc. And a lot of the time, tribunes go on to have distinguished political careers. I mean, there are plenty of consuls by the 2nd century BC who have tribunate of the plebs earlier in their career. Only the plebeian ones, of course. I mean, the patriciate persists because it's a hereditary status through the male line, and there is no mechanism for making new ones after the end of the regal period. It erodes, right? As any aristocracy, any hereditary aristocracy that doesn't have a mechanism for self-replication will erode. So there are fewer and fewer patricians around, and for most things, it doesn't really seem to matter very much. I suspect we overestimate that. I mean, one of my kind of side issues that I've never got around to thinking about seriously is actually why the patriciate seems to matter quite a lot at the very end of the Republic. But anyway, don't ask me further. I don't know the answer. So you've got the tribunate of the plebs. And the other thing about the tribune of the plebs, which goes back to its origins again, is the veto power of tribunes. So tribunes can veto all sorts of things. They can veto a Senate vote so that it ceases to have any executive capacity. They can impose their veto over a legislative assembly. They can also veto each other, which doesn't seem to be envisaged originally, but clearly becomes, people think, aha, this could be handy. So it's a really complicated and interesting office, but what's interesting about it in particular is the way that it carries on being useful even after the circumstances of its original creation no longer apply. And it's absolutely vital in many ways for some of the kinds of things we see happening at the late Republic. Not that one wants them to assume that if you don't have a tribunate you can't have political violence, but it possibly shapes some of the odder episodes we see.
Mm-hmm. So, and then briefly, before we start our chronology here, you mentioned the consuls.
Yes.
So give the brief version of what is the consular power in this period of the Republic.
So there are 2 consuls every year, and it's not an accident you have 2. Power sharing is absolutely fundamental to how the Republic distributes power. You always have a colleague, unless it's an emergency and we need a dictator. Dictator doesn't have a colleague, but so 2 consuls to prevent overreaching, and they are the chief magistrates. So there is certainly by the end of the 2nd century, end of the 3rd century, something called a cursus honorum, a chain of honours has emerged. There's an order in which you hold positions, and they get more senior.
And so that's the path that in normal times one would have to go through in order to reach that level.
Yeah, and it's a pyramid. I mean, quite how steeply slanted the pyramid is varies at different points, but kind of more entry-level officers than the 2 consuls that are elected every year. So it's a pinnacle, and it's not automatic, etc., and it's very heavily fought over, in fact. One of the challenges to anybody who doesn't really believe that Roman politics has a democratic element is to explain why consular campaigns are so bitterly fought on occasion, which they are. Consuls, up until Sulla's dictatorship in the late 80s, the consul's main job is to command an army. Right. So each year, the Senate makes a strategic view of where the military challenges for the coming year are, and that allows them to identify 2 consular provinciae. Now, provincia in Latin is obviously where we get our word province from, but it originally means a job. So there are 2 jobs, and then they're allocated to the 2 consuls. And if you've got other jobs, you give them to the praetors, who are the next most senior down.
A job in the meaning of a task, a specific...
A task, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Go and fight in Liguria. Go and defeat Antiochus III, whatever it might be. And the thing about consuls and praetors is they have something called imperium. An imperium allows you to command an army, and it's allocated through election to office. The Senate can choose to extend imperium, but they can't, or they shouldn't. How you get kind of non-standard imperium, again, interesting point in the late Republic, but it can only be allocated by the people. And so that's why consuls matter, and praetors, they are the people who are commanding armies.
What I find fascinating here, and we'll circle back to this throughout, is in describing these offices, I've heard you use words like they are supposed to do this, or they should do this, and this, and that in itself builds in the concept of there were norms, there were established understandings of what was allowed and what should not be allowed under this structure. And so some of the things that came up as changes, not necessarily on the path towards more political violence, but there were changes and evolutions to the system as in any polity. So around 145, you had somebody actually up while in the forum, get on the podium and speak to the people, which I guess was a change. A few years later, you move from open voting to a secret ballot. So there were changes in politics during this time that were not necessarily directly related or correlated with one direction or the other on political violence. But we do get to what I've seen as a momentous event from reading your work and many others, some of the more popular books in the United States that have brought alive the Roman Republic in recent years. We had Mike Duncan's popular podcast, The History of Rome, which he wrote the book The Storm Before the Storm, a bestseller in the US. And then not long after, historian Edward Watts published Mortal Republic, How Rome Fell into Tyranny. And both of them, of course, emphasize the year, as you do in some of your work, of 133. So here we are. We have the Gracchi brothers. We don't necessarily need to get into their political, reforms, and that's all very interesting in many ways, especially related to some of the issues you've talked about with the people and politics. But the way I understand it is there was another, was it a tribune, Octavius or something, who opposed Tiberius's agrarian law. And Tiberius basically called upon the people and said, okay, I have people power behind me. Let's depose this guy. And then that leads to a cycle where there's some backlash against him, so that when Tiberius wants to be tribune again, which is not a thing that you're supposed to do right away, suddenly there's real tension that brings out some violence. So tell me where I got that backstory wrong. And then let's lead up to the actual election in 133 that creates the amazing violence on the what is it, the Capitoline Hill in Rome.
Yes, well, I think you're absolutely right to put the nature of his program slightly on one side. I mean, it's not because it's not important. It's redistribution effectively. It's
Right.
agrarian redistribution. He's offering small subsistence level farming plots to Roman citizens who do not possess land, and he's going to find this land by reimposing historic limits that have been neglected in terms of renting public land. So this isn't about the dispossession of private owners. It's about how you use state resources, because the Roman state owns a lot of land as a result of conquest within Italy. But you're right not to focus on that, because that doesn't seem to be the fundamental problem. It's very unwelcome to at least large parts of the elite. There's a lot of opposition to it, but it is passed into law, and actually his agrarian, even after he's dead, the Agrarian Commission carries on working and seems to allocate land. So whatever it is that he does, it's not that. You're right too, I think, to point to the deposition of Octavius as an innovation that doesn't trigger Tiberius's death because of the timescales. Months pass between that moment, which is connected with the agrarian legislation early in the year, and his attempt to be re-elected. But it contributes, right? Because the problem, I think, is that Tiberius, or at least Tiberius's enemies, think he is a tyrant. That is the nature of his threat. He is looking to become sole ruler of Rome. And
even within the system, with these inherent checks and balances and the multiple offices and the frequent elections, the very act of, with such popular support, the very act of him seeking the tribunate again is seen as a step towards tyranny.
Yeah. I'm not claiming that he was, but that's what it looks like. And of course, there is a strong tradition in early Rome, in the history of early Rome, about tyranny and tyrant killers. Men who aspire to tyrannical power within after the expulsion of the kings. Men who seek to be kings, right? So there's this paranoia, or at least Roman historiography writes into its history a paranoia about soul power, and an absolute obligation to root out soul power wherever you find it. And that's not, I think, necessarily the attitude that modern historians tend to bring to Tiberius Gracchus, because it seems, how on earth could he be trying to be tyrant? But I think that's what's fueling the opposite, the kind of violence against him at the end of the year. And it's not just because he deposes Octavius. The seeking to be re-elected is a major part of it, but also if you look at the accounts of his year in office, he's also intervening in foreign policy in ways that the tribunes of the plebs don't. Right, that's a senatorial prerogative. That seems to be the norm that has emerged as the Senate deals with foreign policy. And he's asking the people to make decisions about foreign policy. But there are also rumours about his own ambition, that the clothes he's wearing, the way he's comporting himself, etc., etc. And then I think it's the attempt to be re-elected, because you've got colleagues. Okay, nobody apart from the dictator is there on his own, and you don't have dictators, and actually by this point you haven't had a dictator for 70 years. And the other thing that limits power is annual tenure of office. Right, kind of end of year comes, you've got rid of him, whoever he is. So that limits tyrannical ambition. And the idea that somebody with all this popular support might set aside that in a way that, if he stands once for office again, when's he going to stop?
And one thing reading, again, I'm not reading the original Latin, I'm reading multiple historians and others rewriting and interpretation of this. But one of the takeaways I have is that Tiberius did go beyond the norm in politics by, realizing that he was under physical danger despite his office, that he did bring, depending on what word you use, he brought a mob with him. He had a posse around him. He often used physical bodies, including at this election the night before, sleeping with supporters surrounding him and taking a mass of people there so that rabble-rousers would not be able to physically assault him or disrupt the process. At least that was the idea. Was that normal by that point in Roman elections, that you had mass bodies there, maybe not explicitly engaging in violence, but with the hint that there's enough people here that you don't want to mess with us because, look, I've got hundreds or thousands of people behind me that are at least a physical presence?
No, it isn't. And I would also be a bit sceptical about seeing that as Tiberius' strategy towards the end of the year. The extraordinary moment towards the end of 133 is not anything that Tiberius is doing, apart from the fact that he wants to hold office for another year. It's the response of a group within the Senate. It's not even a senatorial response. Yeah. That is the truly gobsmacking moment. And it's important to remember that it's not a senatorial response. It's not an official response. In fact, the consul, one of the consuls is absent from Rome. I think he's in Sicily. Musius Scaevola, who is present and who chairs that meeting, says explicitly he's not going to take action. The laws will provide sufficient remedy if anything that the assembly that Tiberius is convoking does is illegal.
Which is chilling in the modern sense because, of course, you can't talk about history without interpreting it through what you're going through at the time. And obviously, as an American looking at the events of January 6th a few years ago, I see the importance of changes in norms and the precedents they can set and all of the issues that could come up. And someone saying, well, don't worry because the law will take care of itself. Like, oh, well, people make choices. Laws don't make choices.
Yeah,
people
okay.
Make choices.
But I think Scaevola is trying to calm things down.
Oh, yeah. It could be with good intentions, of course, right?
He's trying to calm things down. He is saying we do not need to resource to violence. Yeah. The existing structures and mechanisms of our res publica will suffice to deal even with this threat. That is what Scaevola is saying.
Yeah.
But Nasica, a senator, but not holding any office in this year, says that is inadequate. We face a threat which we must take steps to eliminate. But the group of senators he leads, and presumably, men they have with them. I mean, one of the really interesting questions in trying to make sense of that senatorial debate is how far has Nasica prepared? And I think he must have prepared. I don't think it's real. I think he must have gamed what was likely to happen, and he must have expected Scaevola, whose reputation and policy is all kind of known. There's nothing inconsistent with previous behaviour that Scaevola does. Yeah. He must have thought through, this is a possible outcome. We may get to the end of this debate with an explicit refusal to put a question that would allow us to take any action. So to that extent, I think he is not going in unprepared. So his followers, those who stand up and follow him, and I suspect plenty of non-senatorial members of their household who are waiting outside. They are making a decision that has no basis in any understanding of the res publica. This is private violence.
Right. But
of course, Nasica is Pontifex Maximus. So again, one of the interesting things about what's happening in the autumn of 133 is how is he using other forms of authority?
And the Pontifex Maximus, loosely the high priest, right? A figure of
chief
much
priest.
reverence.
Roman religion is, again, it's based on collectives. So there are different colleges which cover different religious specialities. You've got augurs and you've got groups in charge of festivals. But the pontifices, I think, are generally regarded as the most senior and the most generalist in terms of this economy. And they, unlike the other colleges, do have one member who is in a position of authority, the Pontifex Maximus, who has a whole range of specific ritual activities that he is required to carry out.
So in this case,
priests hold office for life. Unlike magistrates.
Right. So we've alluded to this, but here we go. In this case, you have the Pontifex Maximus, you have some members of the Senate, and suddenly a mob comes to the hill. No weapons are allowed, right? There's still there's some sense of the sacred for the election, and yet somehow this mob is, ripping table legs off, finding tools and clubs, and before the next hour or two are up, suddenly you have Tiberius and hundreds, probably around 300 of his supporters dead. And then the aftermath, which is, what happens? This is such a violation of norms up to that point. It's shocking reading this and not seeing this as, in a sense, a wake-up call that whole system we've talked about should almost reflexively rebel against this kind of dramatic violence. And yet, sure, the Pontifex Maximus is sent off on an embassy overseas, but most senators who are involved and others see no consequence to their actions. They're not held to direct personal account. And Tiberius himself is denied traditional funeral arrangements. That doesn't seem like a repudiation of political violence.
No. I think it's easy to underestimate the reaction. Harriet Flower has some wonderful stuff on this in The Art of Forgetting. And she does make the argument that actually, if we look at the expiatory activity that the Senate authorises, it does look as though it is conscious at least of a gross offence against the gods.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. There has been a lot written about the accounts of Tiberius's death and of what Nasica was up to, and in particular, whether he was consciously acting as Pontifex Maximus in this moment, kind of his garb, the fact that it's, the men he is leading turn up armed, right? You don't find yourself on the Capitol with a heavy piece of wood in your hand by accident, but they're not using bladed weapons, so is that some sort of religious prohibition? And I do think we need to ask whether one of the reasons that the sources are a bit difficult to interpret and that places are not saying the same things is precisely because the historians of Rome who tried to make sense of this episode were grappling with themselves with the problem of what did it mean to have the Pontifex Maximus do this?
Right.
Did he have an official position? Was this a religious act, or was it just the act of a privatus who has gone off any sense of norms and
it certainly wasn't normal or typical, but you're saying that there
absolutely
was
not.
a debate whether, despite the fact that this was not a usual activity, was it something that was in some way appropriate or understandable?
Exactly. What might the argument look like if you were trying to explain this? It doesn't look as though that argument had much traction at the time.
Right.
And as you've noticed, Nasica departs and in fact dies before he returns. But there are also inquiries. An inquiry is set up by the Senate into what has happened. And one of the things that does is to interrogate Tiberius's followers. And in some cases, exact punishment from them. So, there are a whole range of official activities which are trying to make sense of this. But you're right, it doesn't seem to lead to any profound changes. the official view seems to be, this has been a horrible, horrible disaster. Let us, try to move
reflect on
on
it.
from it. Let's reflect on it. Let's try to move on, without necessarily thinking, are there systematic elements within the state that led to this happening? And you know what? That's not, I think, a completely incomprehensible approach, because it was bizarre, right?
Yeah.
Nasica did do something that was extraordinary.
Yeah. Yeah. We see it many times.
So
We see it echoed many times, though. That is, when a system is shocked, when something happens that is so outside the norm, it's almost like the body politic can't understand it for how off the standard deviation curve it is. That, well, let's establish a commission to understand it the same way we do a commission to understand military readiness or social issues. And somehow that normalizes the thing that is abnormal, to even treat it like something that is just worthy of a commission and all this, without direct and immediate accountability. So it's a reflection of an advanced political culture, if you will, that there is the sense that something is wrong enough that we do need to discuss this. But I think the act of discussing it and treating it like something like you would many other issues in itself normalizes it and kind of ratchets up the ability for this to be a more regular feature in the future.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. I think it can also, it's such a bizarre and intriguing story that I think it can also distract us from what is fundamentally fueling the last century of the Republic, which is inequality. An urban populace that is deeply disaffected and who sees its leaders killed regularly from now on.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we don't understand this in part because I think so much of the history on Rome goes to these great figures, right? People read about Caesar, got it. People might read about Octavian, Augustus, and follow, and they love Marcus Aurelius because he was thoughtful sometimes, got it. But unless you're a specialist, you don't really focus on the intersection of the social and political histories and realize that, like most societies in history, there was a vast disparity of wealth, and especially at this time with Roman conquest in some cases, although imperialism hadn't really taken hold, it was just more acquiring. You had people living very, very lavishly within the city next to people living in absolute squalor. And then suddenly somebody comes along and says, well, maybe we should make things a little bit better for them. And eventually maybe there should be some grain so they can not starve at an affordable price. It makes sense looking at it as a political scientist that this sounds like most societies in history face something like this. But the Romans hit it really hard at this period simply because there was such wealth coming in that was isolated to a particular class.
Well, okay, yes, but also because you've got a system which has this big democratic element.
Yeah.
So that there are established mechanisms whereby the Roman people can express their dissatisfaction.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right.
I'm conscious that what I appear to be saying is, if you want stability, have dictatorships, which is not. Please do not misquote me. But that's what makes this explosive. Right?
Yeah.
That at least up until the end of the Republic,
so it's
the Roman people retain a lot of power.
Right. It's explosive, but it's almost like a not a one-time explosive, but it's a massive. In 133, there's this issue. Boom.
Yeah.
It happens, and then it's remarkable that after some of this, navel gazing and self-reflection, and yes, sure, the Pontifex Maximus gets out of town for a while, doesn't make it back, but it actually quiets down for a while. And it seems like the next big flare-up is with his brother, Gaius. And again, a public setting. And in this case, God, my memory's bad. Please fix it. But I think he was seeking a third tribunate. And the Senate sent a consul to basically defend the public because they didn't like what was happening here either. And in this case, there was even more bloodletting. Unclear what happened to Gaius. I thought the sources that I saw said that he had a slave take his life so that he could not be captured. But in this case, you probably had thousands of people executed and just tossed in the river. So yes, 133, you had an explosion. You had this building up, but then it took more than a decade for the next bigger flare-up to happen.
Well, here I think we come back to some of the details of how the Roman system works.
Okay.
Because one of the things about annual elections is you can only elect the people who are standing.
Yeah.
And it is controlled, it's a top-down process that's heavily controlled in terms of who is allowed to stand. There is an absolute agreement that people standing for office in Rome come from the wealthy classes. That may have been slightly less rigorously applied to the tribunate, but we're not talking about representatives who are representative, right? So partly it depends on who's holding office, and that I think is one of the factors in terms of this sense that Republican politics is a bit like a pot of soup. And a bit's going to bubble up, and then another bit, but it's at times the surface is calm. And we can see that pattern carrying on, and it's one of the reasons why Republican politics can look so fun from a narrative point of view, because it's always about individuals. We don't have parties, right? So the continuity, one of the mechanisms that we are entirely familiar with for the continuity of political activity, no longer exists. So one of the factors I think is the lack of continuity of leadership imposed by annual offices in combination with the absence of political parties. So there's no mechanism for carrying on Tiberius's program except someone else stands up and says, I'm going to carry on.
Right, right.
The other thing, and of course that's what Gaius Gracchus does. There's about 10 years gap
Eventually
between them. When he does eventually turn up, he very clearly seems to be drawing on the legacy of his brother as a way of accessing popularity in office. But they are really different. The odd thing about Roman history is we study the Gracchi. There's a kind of week in which you lecture on the Gracchi, or you write your essay on the Gracchi, or whatever it is, as though they are the same. And there are really interesting similarities. Obviously, they are brothers. Obviously, they hold the tribunate of the plebs. They are putting forward redistributive programs, and they die violently. How could, it's kind of repeat. But it's not. Yeah. And the circumstances of his career and his death are different. One of the really interesting things about Gaius Gracchus is he's managed to normalise repeated office holding. Right. The moment at which he stands for and is successfully elected to the tribunate really doesn't seem to be kind of the crisis that we thought it was going to be in 133. That seems to be fine. And the Senate, in fact, or at least his opponents, attempt to undermine him by honing in on this peculiarity of the tribunate, which is you have multiple tribunes. So they suborn, or they put up to stand as tribune somebody who will put forward a programme that is a rival to Gaius Gracchus, is in some ways more exciting for the voters, but at the same time, in other ways, undermining him, reducing his popular support and so on. Hence his failure to get elected for a third year and his attempt to be re-elected. But the other thing that is completely different about Gaius Gracchus' death is it is authorised by the Senate. We do not have a maverick like Nasica looking at a senatorial debate and saying this is not enough, this is not adequate. The Senate passes a decree which, as you noted, instructs the consul to see that the res publica suffers no harm. So it's very open-ended, and Lucius Opimius takes that and he uses it in order to deploy armed force within the city of Rome to crush an uprising. What Gaius Gracchus has done, which provides the legitimating moment for the senatorial decree, is after violence at an assembly, he has retreated to the Aventine Hill, the traditional location of plebeian culture within Rome, and kind of seized it militarily. So we now have an uprising within the city of Rome, and that is the moment at which the Senate can say, we need to take action.
Yeah. And whether that's reality or an excuse, it doesn't matter, because it is an understandable reason why they could get forces together to put down an uprising.
Exactly, it's an uprising, which is not really what Tiberius was up to on the Capitol the day he died.
Not at all.
So very different, very different. And you can unpack it. You can say Gaius knew what happened to his brother and is acting preemptively, but it's a very different setup. And of course, one of the things that it is really striking, I think, is this is the moment at which the Senate claim an entirely new set of powers. I think that this is a much more significant moment, really, than 133, in terms of destabilising the operation of politics. Because I think once you have a situation in which the Senate can declare an emergency which justifies lethal force, and once that has been kind of accepted in the courts, because Epimeus is tried the year after he's consul and he's acquitted, then it's quite difficult to know what the limits on plebeian activity can possibly be faced with this willingness to repress.
At a minimum, what the Senate did injected more uncertainty into the overall system, which, when you have uncertainty about the evolving roles and can the Senate really do that, and what do the plebs do here, and then it makes sense that in less than 20 years you have a Marius who comes in and, in a sense, I'm not sure consciously, hard to tell, we don't have accounts of what he was thinking along the way, but takes advantage of this and finds a way that these norms of not being a tribune, in succession, in successive elections, and, Marius just blows it all away and ends up.
Well, yeah, I mean, he does. I am slightly hesitant about saying it's all the same story.
Right. Yeah, I'm trying to find a theme that I'm not sure exists, but it's definitely one of a period of, within living memory, in succession, 133, 121, around 100 with Marius, these relatively long established norms of political behavior intersecting with violence seem to be ratcheting up. And they're all for different reasons, and each case is different and unique, and yet there is almost that through line, the subtext of, and you thought things couldn't get darker. Well, guess what? They're going to get even a little bit darker as we go along.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right to say that we can identify that kind of theme. I mean, I think you could say that the Roman Republic is unlucky in facing three distinct challenges, against none of which it turns out to have adequate internal mechanisms. One is inequality and kind of the what I suspect is a fairly constant desire for betterment among the plebeians, finding an internal voice in the tribunes Gaius and Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. But you could argue that kind of movement is very effectively stomped on. And that the next thing which causes problems is completely distinct. It is the invasion of northern Italy by Germanic-speaking tribes, which is a separate crisis. And that's the crisis that Marius serves, right? He's not being elected consul year after year because the people like him. He's being elected consul year after year because they are terrified, and he seems to be the person who might solve this problem. And remember, it's not just that the Gauls and the Germans have arrived. They have pasted Roman armies. Right? We have major military disasters at the end of the 2nd century BC. And the third, and I would argue, I mean, there are linkages, but in many ways a distinct crisis is the fact that Rome has been neglecting its relationship with its Italian allies.
Not without consequence.
Not without consequence. And their grievances, however you want to parse the demand for citizenship, whatever you think is actually going on there, the wider context is in grievances of the second-class member of a partnership bubbling up in 90, and again triggering violence. Though at that point, violence that makes what's happened previously look, entirely trivial, because this is civil war. That's what breaks out in 91. I mean, the Romans don't call it a civil war; they call it a social war because it's a war between them and their allies. But it's effectively the entire Italian peninsula is under arms, split in two camps.
Do I remember correctly that? And I'm forgetting the year, it might be 199, somewhere in there. Marius imprisoned Saturninus or something of that.
Saturninus, yes,
Saturninus.
there is a moment of violence, and again, it's connected with attempts at re-election. So
Yeah.
Saturninus, the tribune,
So what
back in,
happened there? And I in my memory, I'm linking it to another ratcheting up of kind of different norms where I was thinking like a tribune, a quaestor, a praetor, like many people were imprisoned and ultimately stoned to death. But am I
it's
conflating
Appian.
stories?
It's Appian, isn't it? Who
Okay.
says there you had a tribune and a praetor and a
Yeah.
quaestor lying dead in their robes of office. Well, it's another great story because a mob, they take the three of them, their followers. Well, they do what uh, rebels in a Greek city-state do. They seize the capital.
Well, there's
So they
that.
take refuge in the Senate House,
Yeah.
and a mob turns up and climbs up the walls and stones them to death with the roof tiles. Yeah, and that's, I mean, again, that kind of points to the way that however much we want to come up with neat explanations, it's such a complicated system because that is the point at which Marius is forced into the reactionary position. He
Right.
had been an ally of Saturninus, but he's the consul and he stands by with this act of violence. He does not side with them. But yes, that I think is relatively straightforward to align to a tradition of tribunes attempting to articulate popular will and attempting to secure the popular will by re-election to avoid a movement, a scheme, a policy fizzling out by seeking re-election, and that still being regarded as, despite Gaius Gracchus's apparent tweak of that, still being regarded as too dangerous to contemplate.
There is a sense I have to speak to a larger issue of history, and I think it's just part of human psychology, is we look back at what happened, and because we see the before and the after, that what happened at some maybe even subconscious level, we think happened because it was supposed to happen, or that was the natural consequence, because this led to this, which then led to this, that there's almost a path dependency. And yet we realize there are contingencies and there are human choices. And like you said, Marius could have decided not to stand back and stand down and let these people be stoned to death. And for me, trying to understand that psychology of why people make choices like that, it's hard not to look at this series of things that happened over the previous two generations of some of the changes in the norms around public behavior. Yes, the circumstances are quite different.
Yeah.
But is it easier for somebody to essentially engage in violence or allow massive violence within the city because that dam had been broken, that precedent had been set, and so it was no longer outside of the scope of imagination? Or am I reading too much into it?
No, I don't think you are. I think that is an absolutely fair comment because there's dreadful things have happened and the res publica is still here. So on one level, it points to resilience and a capacity to solve these problems, not now without violence, but a capacity to solve problems until it's too late to solve them that way. So I think that is right. And I think also what we have is an awareness of recent history and a development of strategies by people coming at this from different political perspectives. So there are some interesting moments in the 60s BC. I mean, we're jumping over Sulla, who I'm sure we'll come back to, but after the tribunate has been restored, there are moments in the 60s where tribunes, I think, are absolutely looking back to the 130s in terms of techniques. The idea that you could depose another tribune, that you could do so on the basis that they are not articulating the popular will. Some really interesting stuff that's actually fundamentally about tribunician sacrosanctity. Because there's that moment where the performance comes down to reading out a law. Okay, so that part of the legislative process, you use a herald to read out a law. So what happens if you clap your mouth over the herald, your hand over the herald's mouth? You stop things, don't you?
Yeah.
What happens if the tribune has then learnt the law by heart and carries on reading it aloud?
Yeah.
etc., etc. So I think there's a real historical awareness now of techniques, which is absolutely fascinating, and at the same time it can distract one because it's kind of not the integral issue. It's the mechanics by which these actors attempted to further their own interests.
Yeah.
But do we need to pause and think about Sulla? Because I mean, you've talked about a narrative, and our desire to see these moments of popular reaction, of popular activity in a pattern. And one of the things that I think Sulla does is he shows that we're not alone in that. Because if you look at Sulla's dictatorship, after he's won a civil war, the civil war that the social war turned into, etc., etc. We don't go into details, but once he's returned with his army and seized control of Rome, it's as though he thinks, okay, the problem is tribunes. Get rid of tribunes and Rome will be peaceful and stable. And that's clearly a limited interpretation. And it's not the only thing that Sulla does, let's face it. But it's also interesting that it's a solution that can't hold.
Yeah.
And it can't hold because popular reaction against it says this has unbalanced the state to the extent that we're not prepared to play in it.
It's a Band-Aid, I think we would say now, right?
Yes, maybe.
It's a solution to an immediate problem, but it's not sustainable for a festering wound.
Which again, it says something interesting about the nature of participation as an integral element in the Roman state.
So the whole Marius Sulla back and forth is a whole graduate class in and of itself. But two things that I find looking at all of this, actually, whether it's the Gracchus or the Marius Sulla debates, I think people are projecting backwards their own political views and looking for good guys and bad guys, and it's just not that simple. I found, and honestly I don't remember which sources I read first, but I read about Sulla, and it certainly read like who, and this was not your writing. This is not a way of subtly saying something about your scholarship, but others. And it kind of looked like they were trying to put Sulla into the big bad bully stereotype. And then when I read some details, I thought it's not that simple. Sulla actually did something interesting. Yes, he held authoritarian power. There were no doubt, the revenge and the prescription lists when he came back to Rome were horrible in many, many ways looking back. And yet, here's somebody who had essentially absolute power. And a couple of years later, willingly gave it up. Not in the same tradition as a Cincinnatus or in our, we always look at George Washington as being the hero who walked away from power when he could have had more. But we can't deny that Sulla did that he thought he was returning the best of the Roman system. He thought he was resetting politics to get rid of some of these things that we've been talking about now for some time. And then he actually did that at that time, which doesn't fit some of our backward projections of, well, was he bad because he did this and that corrupts everything? I think we get confused in our own heads when we try to read history as a reflection of our own current political debates and our philosophical disagreements now.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Sulla is extraordinary. If you look at him as somebody who wanted to be a dictator in our sense.
Yeah.
But it makes complete sense if you think of him as somebody who was trying to do what he claimed to do, which is to restore the res publica, right? So you need a moment of intervention.
Yeah.
And he uses the office of dictator, which is established within the Roman constitution, even though it hasn't been used for a century, precisely. Well, that's an interesting point. Tim Cornell has a very interesting piece about this when he points out that actually most dictatorships we know are not really about crisis. They're about doing a particular job when you don't have anybody else around to do that job, and it needs to be sufficiently senior.
A fixer.
Yes, but I suppose the war against Carthage does give us a different model of the dictator with the Cunctator. And that Sulla seems to be calling on that to justify this position. So once he's done what he thinks he needs to do, then obviously he steps down because that's what you do. So we need a different frame of reference. I mean, I'm a bit uncomfortable about too many attempts to rehabilitate Sulla, because one of the things he does alongside this approach, which you could absolutely say was a high-minded commitment to the res publica, is he makes it extremely difficult for anybody to unpick his thing through the prescriptions. I mean, once you own a piece of property that was owned by somebody who has been murdered by state-sanctioned violence and whose heirs have been disappropriated, you find yourself with a really powerful commitment to the status quo. And if you want to read something that's really chilling and alarming in all sorts of ways, the final paragraph of Cicero's speech on behalf of Roscius of Ameria is a really revealing read, because that's Cicero's first big public speech. He'd spoken in a civil trial earlier. Pro Quintio is his debut, but the Pro Roscio Ameria is his first big public speech, and it's a high-profile case. It's a really salacious murder, because a man is accused of murdering his father. First case to take place after Sulla has re-established the law courts, because law is an essential concept of how he sees the res publica can operate. And for various complicated reasons we don't need to go into, the legal case is also implicated in the prescriptions. And if you look, and Cicero, as a young ambitious politician who is seeking to make his way in the new Sullan Republica, he's not going to criticise this res publica. He does have some interesting things to say about Sulla, which are sometimes read as criticism. I don't think they really can be, but it's the final paragraph that always strikes me, when he talks about the erosion of humanitas that takes place if we do not show mercy to one another. And this is in the context of seeking acquittal for his client, who, if convicted, would face a peculiarly horrible death penalty. But kind of in the context in which you read this and you think, I mean, we don't know that Cicero himself personally benefited from the descriptions. He may well not have done. But he consistently throughout his career maintains and defends the Sullan regime, particularly around, say, the political rights of the children of the proscribed. And you read that and you think, look at the contortions which this moment of reconstruction has imposed on those who participated, and which will continue to reverberate right down until the civil war between Caesar and Pompey.
Is it frustrating to you as a historian of this period that Julius Caesar, that at least the contours of the Caesar story are known very widely? The Gracchi brothers get a lot of attention. And Sulla, who I find infinitely more interesting in many ways, is almost forgotten between the two, and people don't realize that so much of what happened before and after really does come together there.
Yes, I know, and I mean, there's a Plutarch biography, so really, there's no excuse. I mean, we talked a bit about the way in which the Sullan constitution doesn't persist, and the removal of the restrictions on what tribunes could do that he imposed is really the major one there. But I think it's quite misleading to say that the Sullan constitution doesn't persist. It persists in two vitally important ways. First of all, the legal framework that Sulla kind of creates with the quaestiones, which admittedly draw on earlier legislation. They are in place, and in fact, in some cases, last a very long time indeed. But the other thing is his changes to the nature of the Senate persist. So it's Sulla who raises the number of the quaestors to 20, and who makes the quaestorship automatic qualifying office for the Senate. So the censors are really, or at least that element of their job is rendered redundant. And so you've got the Senate has doubled in size, much larger, and it's filled now with men who aren't going to hold any further office. So the nature of the Senate as an advisory body changes in ways that I'm still grappling with, but I think are really important for the end of the Republic. And it also kind of changes the nature of political competition.
Right.
Because the expansion in the nature of the quaestorship does bring a whole new group of men into the Senate. But there's no corresponding change to the higher offices, apart from, well, the quaestorship moves from 6 to 8. So you've got a kind of some weird things are going on within what had previously been a much more cohesive ruling elite. And that, I think, reverberates in really odd ways through the next 3 decades.
I'm fascinated by, and I'm trying to think through the implications and doing it poorly of your thoughts there. That some of the changes, the Sullan Constitution, and other elements of the Republic, we always look back and we want to put firm dates on things, right? The Republic ended on this date and the
Yeah.
Empire started on this date. But Octavian himself, as Augustus, he was princeps. He was not emperor.
Yep.
He was perhaps in his mind, I'm not sure, but in some other people's minds, it was certainly a different flavor of the Republic, but it was the Roman Republic just with some different leadership. And the Senate did exist, obviously, for quite some time. There's probably more discontinuity than consistency in many important elements. But you wrote in your book, The End of the Roman Republic, you wrote, the process of political change was lengthy, often obscure to its participants, and full of unintended consequences. And that captures so much right there, because the process of political change was lengthy. Yes, you can look at any particular reform and say that was vital, but the overall change, we're talking about hundreds of years here as we look for where the Republic had its fissures that became cracks, where those cracks were sealed and new ones emerged, and then obscure to its participants. And this fascinates me because as a historian trying to look back to what everyone was thinking and feeling when you only have a few very good sources, we don't know. We don't know whether people just before or after Sulla, or just before or after Tiberius, did they feel like the Roman Republic was the same republic with a few little tweaks that maybe they liked or didn't like? Or did they feel like they were in a fundamentally different era? The writings seem to reflect they recognized it was still the Republic, and most people were trying to rescue it from who they perceived as the bad guys. But I do wonder along the way, which is, at what point did people start to realize, maybe not until Augustus, but at what point did people start to realize that this isn't the Republic that my grandparents talked about?
Yeah. Well, I think that's absolutely right, but I think we can still say there are key dates, right? There are days where things change.
Oh, yes. We've talked about some of them here. After thousands of years, there's no shortage of places to dig in and look at this history through a new lens. And hopefully it's for the positive. In some ways, it's because of negative reasons. Like I said, for me, reflecting a lot on January 6th, I found myself going back time and time again to say, how do norms change when there is no political accountability for the destruction of at least some version of, democratic Republican norms? And so this has been a fascinating trip back to reflect on some of those things. Looking back yourself, most historians I know are very conscious of the fact and teach about the fact that we look at history through the modern lens. We're looking at it through what we're experiencing now, but are very hesitant to draw lessons and say, because this happened in 133 or in 121 or in 100 or in 44, therefore this is exactly what we should do now. But you are frequently asked to do that anyway, and it's fair to ask you to shed some insight on current day affairs, even if not answers directly from the past. But how do you find that people can find insights from what happened and under very different circumstances find some of the variables that are similar enough that at least it helps us to prepare ourselves for what's coming?
Yes, I mean, where to start, how to do it. One of the reasons I find Roman political history is so interesting historiographically is it has absolutely caught fire, I think, in the last 10 years at precisely the point at which, at least from a European perspective, the post-war social democratic consensus has collapsed. While we had a post-war social democratic consensus, we tended to think that Republican politics weren't that interesting because it was all going to be organised by a basically moderately competent bureaucratic class. Hence, I think the willingness to subscribe to the oligarchic control model of Roman politics. Nothing much interesting happens here. There's no policy here. It's about bureaucratic elites trying to keep control of themselves. I simplify radically. And as soon as kind of that's not your worldview, you realise that we're not actually on the Whig escalator heading towards ever calmer waters of technocratic excellence. Then actually the idea that Roman politics might be about something becomes kind of interesting and helpful. But I think one of the things about the Roman Republic that I think is particularly helpful to think with is actually to go back to the constitutional questions, however dull and tedious they might seem to be. Because the absence of separation of powers seems to me to be one of the really interesting problems that the Roman Republic never faced. There is no authority outside authority. And when that's an annually elected authority, particularly if you're willing to believe that elections can throw up surprising results, suddenly everything looks really quite fragile. So this is, if anything, this is a plea to get the details right.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And again, not personal, but just let us actually think about this as a political system which has norms and rules.
Right.
And that framework has some really quite gaping holes in it.
And I would add, to use your own words, the importance of using those gaps to look at the interpretation. In a 2014 article in the Journal of Ancient History about the Roman Senate, you wrote Roman political life was determined not solely by its rules. It was the product of rules interpreted in practice. And having the ability to look at, not just listing making your students memorize the, what the laws and the offices and the terms were and all of that, but actually look at the practice, the actual interpretation of those rules and their evolution over time. That is interesting not only in and of itself, but that is interesting for looking at how we interpret our own rules and norms in politics and society today.
And I think one really important part of that practice is to think about the arguments that are used, both that may have motivated people, but more importantly, the arguments that they use to justify a particular position. Mm-hmm. And that comes back to why we haven't talked very much about public speech, but this is an environment in which the debate is happening there. Okay, some of it's in the Senate, behind, or at least within an enclosed space, but a lot of it is happening there in front of the people. So how do you articulate in public the claims of a Gaius Gracchus against the claims of a Lucius Opimius, and so on and so forth? And where we can begin to trace those arguments, that is where some really interesting stuff can happen.
Well, it is our tradition on this podcast to finish the conversation by me reaching into this box, the chatter box, which, as you can see, has a bunch of pre-printed questions. And I pull one out at random and put you on the spot just because I can. Who is someone in your field or a related one whose work more people should be following? This is your chance to shout out a colleague or someone whom you are admiring their work and say that this is worth other people checking out if they're interested in this general topic.
Harriet Flower.
Harriet Flower. You mentioned her earlier.
There's a whole, she's an absolutely wonderful historian of the intersection between society and politics in Roman culture, particularly in the Republic. She's written an absolutely brilliant short book called Roman Republics, in which she argues that our idea that the Roman Republic is a whole is a mistake. We have a series of republics. Yeah. Wonderful book, The Art of Forgetting, which talks about moments of kind of crisis in Roman culture where the only possible way forward can be just to pretend it never happened. A book about ancestor masks. Why did the Romans, or at least why did elite Romans hang their halls with masks of their ancestors, and what did they do with them? And a lot else, many articles as well as monographs. So she's at Princeton, and I think her work is absolutely. We
will put links to those books as well as yours and some of the other things we've mentioned in our show notes. So eager listeners who are not enrolling at the University in Glasgow can find some other ways of satisfying their curiosity about these topics. Catherine, thank you so much for spending this much time with us talking about the real history from this era and what we know, what we don't know, and why it all matters. I appreciate it. That was Chatter, a production of Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. Please subscribe to the podcast and find us on Twitter at ThatWasChatter.